같은 편에겐 영웅이며 적군에게는 두려운 인물. 그는 제3차 대전을 일으키길 원했다. CIA와 미국 특수부대는 어떻게든 그를 체포하기 위해 안간힘을 썼다. 그의 죽음은 미스터리로 남아있으며 시신은 묘비도 세우지 않은 채 비밀리에 매장됐다. 세상으로부터 잊혀질 줄 알았던 그는 전설이 돼 오늘날까지도 살아있다. 그는 젊은이들과 혁명론자들에게 영웅으로 추앙받는 인물이고 수많은 티셔츠에 그의 얼굴이 인쇄돼 있다. 하지만 진짜 체게바라는 이런 평면적 이미지만으로 판단할 수 없는 매우 확고한 목표를 지닌 복잡한 인물이었다.
Che described being a guerrilla as the highest form of humankind, someone who was prepared to sacrifice himself for an ideal. In his case, it was for the cause of Marxism-Leninism, the solution to mankind's ills, and the only way to turn around the world order from one dominated by Yankee capitalism.
존 리 앤더슨의 유명한 저서 체게바라 그 혁명적 삶에서 저자는 전설 속에 가려진 한 남자를 집중 분석한다.
First and foremost, I wanted to know what had led this well-born son of an affluent old Argentine family, a son of the middle class, with everything going for him, to leave that comfortable existence and become the most implacable, well-known revolutionary of his day.
1928년 5월 14일, 체게바라는 에르네스토 게바라 데라 세르나란 이름으로 아르헨티나의 로사리오에서 태어났다.
Ernesto Guevara Lynch was Che's father. Celia was from an illustrious Spanish family.
They were considered to be of the upper class.
카를로스 피구에로아는 체게바라, 즉 에르네스토의 어린 시절 친구다.
Ernesto didn't discriminate. He would hang out with all the kids, whether they were children of privilege or the children of servants.
네 자녀 중 장남이었던 에르네스토는 어려서부터 만성천식에 시달렸고 이는 평생 동안 그를 괴롭혔다. 가족들은 그의 병세가 좀 호전되지 않을까 해서 알타그라시아의 산간마을로 이사했다. 에르네스토는 알타그라시아에서 카레이카 페레르를 만났다.
The boys and girls would gather around to dance, but Ernesto was a really bad dancer. He had a bad ear. We'd be playing one style of music and he'd be dancing to another.
The adolescent Ernesto was known for being hypersexual. His first experience was with the family maid. He would try to seduce any woman of any shape, age, or appearance.
에르네스토의 기이한 면 중에서도 위생관념이 희박하다는 점 때문에 스페인어로 돼지를 의미하는 찬출한 별명이 붙을 정도였다.
He had a shirt called the weekly shirt because he would only change it once a week. We called him Chancho, and it stuck with him ever since. But he didn't mind. He kind of liked it.
에르네스토는 기이한 면도 있었지만 자기 반성적인 성향이 강한 편이었다.
He was always searching for a kind of the meaning for life.
He was more advanced than his peers. He read serious authors.
Nehru and Gandhi and Steinbeck and Faulkner and Mussolini. He was a voracious reader.
에르네스토는 의과대학을 다녔지만 낙후된 라틴 아메리카의 여러 지역을 여행하며 훨씬 많은 깨달음을 얻었다.
Alberto Granado was an older student. He proposed that the two take off for a journey by motorbike the length of Latin America. It was a quest to look beyond the privileged confines that were his birthright.
에르네스토와 알베르토는 의학 학위는 뒤로 미룬 채 라 폰데로사 투란 별명을 붙인 낡은 모튼 오토바이를 타고 1952년 1월 4일 여행을 떠났다.
All we could see was the dust on the road ahead and ourselves on the bike, devouring kilometers in our flight northward.
They traveled down to Patagonia and across to Chile, where La Poderosa finally gave out.
오토바이가 고장난 이후부터는 걷거나 트럭을 얻어 타고 칠레 내륙으로 깊숙이 들어갔다.
They traveled up to see the world's greatest open-pit copper mine, Chuquicamata, which loomed large in the imaginations of Latin Americans in the time because it was U.S.-owned and run. It was this notion of the kind of monstrous capitalist enterprise exploiting the local workers.
아나콘다나 캔콧과 같은 미국 기업은 칠레의 광물 산업을 독점했다.
American companies went to Latin America for two reasons: cheap raw materials and cheap wages.
To a young nationalist and a young idealist of the early 1950s, it would be very hard to look upon U.S. policies as practiced in Latin America kindly.
He saw something that he hadn't seen before. He saw the face of poverty.
Ernesto, being who he was terribly bothered by what he had seen.
에르네스토와 알베르토는 칠레에서 페루를 거쳐 베네수엘라로 향했다. 7개월간의 여행을 끝내고 알베르토는 베네수엘라에 머물기로 했고 새로운 사회적 안목을 얻은 에르네스토는 의과대학 과정을 마치기 위해 부에노스아이레스로 돌아갔다.
All this wandering around our America with a capital A has changed me more than I thought.
When he finished medical school, he said, "See, you thought I couldn't do it, but I graduated. So pack your bags, because we're going to be leaving soon."
에르네스토와 칼리카는 볼리비아로 가는 길에 다른 젊은 여행자들을 만났다.
They were students. They had invited us to see Guatemala.
에르네스토는 이 학생들의 정치 성향과 과테말라의 상황에 흥미를 느꼈다. 그곳에서는 하코보 아르벤스 대통령이 국토 개발을 통한 사회혁명을 꾀하고 있었다.
Arbenz was intent on nationalizing the unused land of the major U.S. banana and fruit companies, particularly United Fruit. Now, of course, United Fruit was a company that had very close ties to the Eisenhower administration. The Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, had been on the board of United Fruit. John Foster Dulles was the brother of Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA. United Fruit paid a very skilled public relations specialist to kind of whip up a frenzy about the threat of communism in this small, impoverished country of Guatemala.
1953년 12월 24일, 에르네스토는 이러한 분위기가 고조된 가운데 과테말라에 첫 발을 디뎠고 얼마 후 피루 출신의 일다 까데아라는 여인을 소개받게 된다.
Hilda immediately became besotted with him. She had even went to the point where she pawned some jewelry in order to keep him in his hostels. And eventually they began sleeping together.
일다는 에르네스토에게 26살의 쿠바 변호사인 피델 카스트로의 추종자들을 소개해줬다. 그는 쿠바의 대통령이자 독재자인 바티스타를 몰아내기 위해 쿠바에서 두 번째로 큰 군 주둔지인 몬카다 평영 공격을 주도했던 인물이었다.
Many of the people that attacked the barracks, a lot of whom were students, former students, workers, organizers, a lot of them were killed, tortured, killed. The ones that survived, including Fidel Castro and his brother, were sentenced to prison.
카스트로는 징역 15년형에 처해졌지만 에르네스토는 그들에게 깊은 감명을 받았다. 쿠바의 다른 친구들과는 달리 에르네스토는 시위나 운동권에 참여한 적이 없었지만 과테말라의 대통령 아르벤스의 탄핵으로 그의 관점이 바뀌었다.
The first CIA-sponsored coup in Latin America took place in Guatemala in 1954. And essentially the army got scared and told Arbenz that he had to resign, and he did.
1954년 6월 24일 카스티요 아르마스가 정권을 잡았다. 그는 미국의 꼭두각시나 다름없는 존재였다. 그는 공산주의자로 의심되는 자와 이전 정권과 관계된 자들을 모두 체포해 잡아들였다. 투옥되거나 어쩌면 사형당할 위기에 놓인 에르네스토는 아르헨티나 대사관으로 피신했다.
He came away convinced that the United States was, as he famously later called it, the enemy of humanity.
Jacobo Arbenz Guzman succumbed before the cold, premeditated aggression of the USA, hidden behind a smokescreen of continental propaganda.
그는 스스로를 마르크스주의자로 규명했다.
Communism seemed to offer a way forward and a ready-made ideology for the kind of new society that could rise from the ashes of the old. Ernesto Guevara, he left Guatemala a very radicalized individual, looking now for a revolution he could fight in.
1954년 9월, 대부분의 좌파와 마찬가지로 에르네스토도 멕시코시티로 떠났다. 카르데나스 전 대통령이 1930년대에 유전을 국유화하는 데 성공한 곳이다.
Mexico had a historic standing as one of the countries on the flank of the United States who had stood up to Yankee imperialism at the turn of the century.
에르네스토는 다시 쿠바의 친구들과 연락했고 라울 카스트로를 소개받았다. 몬카다 병영 포위 작전으로 22개월간의 복역을 마친 그는 형인 피델 카스트로의 조직을 재건하기 위해 멕시코시티로 돌아왔다.
They liked one another. He was a Marxist, as opposed to Fidel, who was still in prison.
바티스타는 국제사회 압력에 못 이겨 결국 복역한 지 불과 2년밖에 안 된 피델을 석방하기에 이르렀다. 피델 역시 멕시코시티로 향했다.
This was a person who had tried to overthrow a dictatorship by the force of arms, and what a lot of people consider almost like a brazen, crazy attack on the Moncada barracks. Now he was exiled from his homeland, and guess what? He was organizing to try and go back and do the same thing.
에르네스토는 예비 공산주의자였던 반면 피델 카스트로는 그 어느 쪽도 아니었다.
He'd gotten into the rough and ready politics of his day and had positioned himself as a patriot and nationalist. He was not yet a Marxist-Leninist.
1955년 8월 추종자들을 그토록 열광하게 한 인물을 보고 싶었던 에르네스토는 라울에게 만남을 주선할 것을 약속받았고 그들의 얘기는 밤새 이어졌다.
Political occurrences having met Fidel Castro, a Cuban revolutionary, a young man, intelligent, very sure of himself, and of extraordinary audacity. I think there is a mutual sympathy between us.
이들의 야망엔 비슷한 점이 많았으며 미국이란 공통의 적에 대항하고 있었다. 에르네스토는 몬카다 공격 날짜로 명명된 7월 26일 운동에 동참할 것을 권유받았다. 그는 쿠바인이 아닌 유일한 사람으로서 군의관으로 등록됐고 체라는 별명까지 얻었다.
Argentines say che when they talk to one another. It's an old term meaning hey you, and so they began calling him che.
과테말라에 홀로 남아있던 일다도 체게바라를 만나러 왔다.
Hilda announced that she was pregnant, which came as a bit of a blow. But curiously, he decided to do the right thing, and he married her.
딸 알레이다가 태어난 지 얼마 되지 않아 체게바라는 쿠바를 위한 사회운동과 시위에 온 힘을 기울였다.
Almost immediately, he was off for long periods of time in a ranch outside Mexico City, where they trained militarily. He turned out to be one of the best shots in the group.
하지만 곧 이 사실이 외부에 알려지면서 체게바라와 피델 카스트로를 비롯한 7월 26일 운동의 구성원들은 대부분 체포 구금됐다. 이들은 한 달 동안의 수감 생활 중에도 지속적으로 작전을 도모했다. 피델 카스트로는 계속해서 바티스타를 축출할 계획을 세우고 자신의 군사 82명을 멕시코에서 쿠바로 빼돌리기 위해 $15,000의 낡은 배 한 척을 구입해 그랜마라는 이름을 붙였다. 5일간의 항해를 앞두고 체게바라는 어머니에게 편지를 써 자신의 행방을 알리고 전투 중에 사망하면 붙여달라고 일다에게 당부했다.
In essence, saying his last goodbyes to Hilda and his young daughter that if he survived, he would see them again. But you know, the revolution called.
1955년 11월 25일 새벽 2시 82명 전원이 그랜마호에 승선했다.
With our lights extinguished, we left the port of Tuxpan amid an infernal mess of men and all sorts of material. Fidel's words began to take on reality. In 1956, we shall be free or we shall be martyrs.
His cause was revolution in Latin America. The next objective was Cuba, to liberate Cuba. And he had ceased to call himself Ernesto Guevara. He had become Che.
스물일곱 살의 체게바라는 피델 카스트로를 비롯한 80여 명의 동지들과 함께 쿠바의 대통령인 풀젠시오 바티스타를 축출하기 위한 원정에 나섰다. 1955년 11월 25일 체게바라 일행은 그랜마호라는 낡은 배를 타고 아바나를 향해 갔다. 한편 플로리다 해안에서 145km 거리에 있는 쿠바 섬에서는 관광 사업이 번창하고 있었다.
Havana was the whorehouse of the Caribbean. It was a place where Americans went on dirty weekends. There were live sex shows, showgirls. It was full of prostitutes, drugs.
It was a carnival atmosphere to which a lot of American tourists flocked. And there were some very positive aspects of it, but there was another Cuba, and the other Cuba was a Cuba that was basically run militarily by dictatorship.
아이젠하워 정부에서 바티스타를 지원해줬지만 쿠바인들은 아이젠하워를 무자비한 독재자로 여겼다.
Fulgencio Batista was as much of a thug as ever governed a Latin American country. He was somebody who was considered beholden to U.S. economic interest, to the interests of the U.S. mafia in Cuba.
그랜마호에서의 일주일은 아주 고되고 험난했다.
The entire boat took on an aspect both ridiculous and tragic. Men with anguished faces, holding their stomachs, some with their heads in pockets, others lying in the strangest positions, immobile, their clothing soiled with vomit.
It was an unmitigated disaster. They lost their bearings, they lost a man overboard, later saved him. When they eventually reached the coast of Cuba, they landed in the wrong place.
쿠바엔 이틀 늦게 도착했고 게다가 대낮이었다. 낡은 배는 라스 콜로라다스에 접근하면서 모래톱에 부딪혔다.
Foundered and had to stumble ashore into a marsh.
그들이 재집결하기도 전에 바티스타의 공군에서 공격을 개시했고 체게바라와 피델 카스트로 일행은 결국 뿔뿔이 흩어졌다. 이후 3일간은 적군을 피할 수 있었지만 12월 5일엔 결국 그 행운도 바닥나고 말았다.
In a matter of seconds, a hurricane of bullets. This only added to the Dantesque and grotesque scenes around us. A stout guerrillero trying to hide behind a single stalk of sugarcane. And another, without really knowing why, crying out for silence in the midst of the tremendous uproar.
More than 2/3 were massacred immediately. Che was wounded in the neck. He had to make a split-second choice between taking with him his rifle and ammunition or the first aid kit. He left the first aid kit and took the ammunition.
체게바라가 다시 카스트로 일행을 만났을 때 그는 눈에 띄게 줄어든 인원을 보고 놀랄 수밖에 없었다.
Only 17 of the original 82 men on board the Granma, amongst them Che and the Castro brothers, Fidel and Raul, were amongst the survivors. The invasion was such a disaster that news reports initially sent out the news that Fidel and Che had died.
피델 카스트로와 체게바라 일행은 재결합해 시에라 마에스트라 산맥을 향해 진군했다.
The Sierra Maestra was the mountain range nearest the coast where they landed and where Fidel planned to base his guerrilla movement.
시에라 마이에스트라는 배교자, 미립국자 그리고 소장농들이 사는 곳이었다.
Either were I or the other farmers in the area aware that there was a revolutionary movement taking place. It took us by surprise. I knew nothing about politics.
16살이었던 다리엘 라미레즈는 베니뇨란 별명을 가졌으며 시에라 마에스트라에서 아버지의 농장 일을 돕고 있었다.
They arrived at my home to ask for food, and we gave them some. But I didn't help them because I sympathized with them. I helped them out of fear of repression.
산간마을 사람들은 이들 일행을 수상하게 여겼다.
Who are these bearded, smelly strangers with guns making a noisome intrusion into their lives?
피델 카스트로는 계속해서 자신들의 편을 들어달라고 농부들을 설득했다.
He decided to impress upon the peasants that he would bring about an agrarian reform. And he did that by basically stealing a bunch of cows from landowners and liberating them and handing them over to the area's peasants. That was a fairly popular move.
카스트로는 반동분자의 존재를 인식시킬 때가 왔다고 생각하고 주변의 군 주둔지를 공격할 계획을 세웠다. 체는 비로소 첫 전투에 참가했다. 1957년 1월 22일 드디어 순찰 중이던 1단의 부대에 잠복 공격을 감행했다. 첫 총성이 울리고 체는 난생 처음 적과 얼굴을 마주했다.
He shot him when he saw him drop. And he seemed to be gauging his own reactions to see how he felt about it. And he felt fine. He felt fine.
이들 조직에서는 조직원 한 명을 처형해야만 했다.
The traitor, a man called Eutimio Guerra, one of their first collaborators, was discovered to be a spy. Fidel sentenced this man to death. No one ever said who had executed Eutimio Guerra, but in Che's personal diary, it emerged that he had, and he described it in vivid detail. Taking the man's possessions from him, exchanging words from him, and then Che stepping up to his side. There was a thunderstorm breaking just then, and placing a revolver at his temple and blowing his brains out with a .25 caliber revolver. Che inspected the entry and exit wound, very much the doctor writing down that he had slept fine with what he had done. From that moment on, Che changed.
War is harsh, and at a time when the enemy was intensifying its aggressiveness, one could not tolerate even the suspicion of treason.
I don't know the final tally of execution victims of Chegebarat, but it was certainly dozens.
(1957년 2월 17일) 쿠바 밀매에 숨어 지내던 피델 카스트로가 이끄는 소수의 혁명군은 정부군의 끊임없는 잠복 공격에 시달리며 배신자들까지 상대해야 했다. 하지만 체게바라의 무자비한 숙청 때문에 혁명군은 차츰 세력을 확장하고 마침내 명성을 떨치게 됐다. 피델 카스트로와 혁명군의 업적은 곧 전 세계 언론의 집중적인 관심을 받게 된다.
A newspaper editor named Herbert Matthews from the New York Times, who had got smuggled up to meet him. Castro gave the impression to Herbert Matthews that he had like 100 to 150 men.
실제 반란군의 수는 불과 20명밖에 되지 않았다. 한 달 후 이것이 기사화되자 피델과 체가 바티스타의 공격으로부터 살아남았다는 사실이 명백해졌고 또한 시에라 마에스트라에서 세력을 확장 중이라는 소식이 퍼졌다. 이에 바티스타는 1,500명 이상의 군사들을 보내 반란군을 진압하도록 했다.
On March 25th, Batista's army arrived at my house. They surrounded my home and opened fire because I had been reported as a collaborator with the rebel army. They killed my wife. That's why I joined the rebel army.
한편 7월 26일엔 도시에서도 반란군 가담자가 발생했다. 그중엔 19살 미국인으로서 관타나모만에서 고등학교에 재학 중이던 총 라이언도 포함됐다. 그에 붙이는 미 해병대 군의관이었다.
We had a large society with the Cubans. We were all friends, and we went to their weddings and their baptisms and things like that. Well, I offered to help them to get gun supplies to fight against the dictatorship.
총 라이언은 관타나모에 사는 두 청소년들과 함께 반란군에 가담하게 된다.
So we talked about it and settled a few things and left letters for our parents.
이 미국 청소년들은 다른 50명의 지원자들과 함께 시에라 마에스트라에 보내졌다. 체는 그들이 처음 만난 사람들 중 하나였다.
I think that the real reason they sent Che was those men that we came with, many of them were very ill because it took us 30 hours of walking to get up those hills with those packs.
다른 미국인 지원자들 중엔 당시 18살이었던 돈 솔디니도 있었다.
Whole rebel army, including Fidel, Che, Raul, and my group, was estimated to consist of 300 men.
반란군 캠프에서의 삶은 순탄치 않았다.
I had no soles on my boots. We ate when we could. Sometimes we didn't have water. We marched for a couple of 100 miles over the mountains. I was plagued with dysentery and what have you.
반란군에게 쿠바의 정글은 온갖 질병의 온상이었으며 체가 치료를 담당했다.
We would get large infected mosquito bites on our legs and things. And he would come over and take the scabs off and put sulfate powder on there.
Men were pretty scared of being treated by him. They called him Dr. Sacamuelas, tooth puller. He was pretty rough. He was not known for his delicacy.
체는 의사로서의 역할을 수행할 뿐 아니라 전투에도 지속적으로 참여했다. 피델보다 훨씬 멋진 사람이었다는 의견이 많다.
Che was a true model in front of us. While Fidel looked for a place of refuge to hide himself, Che was bare-chested. He always rushed to the front lines during battles.
His willingness to confront death, to take life, to risk his own life, came together to form a charisma that was highly unusual and which gave him an almost legendary reputation. And he emerged as a man which others feared and also respected and admired.
체가 전투에서 두각을 드러내자 피델은 1957년 7월 12일 그를 사령관으로 임명했다. 또한 사열 종대란 명칭으로 불린 75인을 지휘할 수 있는 권력을 주었다.
The vanity which we all have in us made me the proudest man in the world that day.
There were those who fell under his leadership and charisma, and particularly very young boys, you have to call them, 15, 16-year-olds. Some of them were runaways who became his disciples, and they became known as Los Cachorros del Che, Che's cubs. He was everything to them, an older brother, a father, a guerrilla leader, an instructor, very much the ideologue. He gave them literacy lessons. He wanted them to read and write.
반면 그의 눈에 띄지 않으려고 애쓰는 이도 존재했다.
He could punish someone for 3 to 6 days without food for something minor. This character and furious discipline of his makes me believe it was fear that we had of him. We feared that he would impose upon us a punishment.
체는 10월에 라메사에 새 본거지를 세웠고 이곳을 본격적으로 정비하기 시작했다. 무기고와 빵집, 정육점, 심지어 엘 쿠바노 리브레라는 신문까지 만들어 발행했다. 1958년 2월엔 라디오 레벨데라는 그들만의 라디오 방송국을 개국해 메시지를 전달하기 시작했다. 공산주의 혁명을 위한 싸움이란 사실을 전부가 아는 것은 아니었다.
If Fidel had told us that it was a communist movement, all of the recruits would have abandoned him, for sure.
There was a lot of concern about Castro's power and rhetoric and who he was. He was a bit of a mystery at that time. The CIA and the U.S. military continued to give Batista weapons.
시에라 마에스트라인 바티스타의 정부군이 활기를 치고 있었지만 반란군은 주민들의 강력한 지지를 받음으로써 여전히 우위를 독점하고 있었다.
Batista's army was on the ropes, and it was to Che that Fidel looked to take the war to the north.
시에라 산맥에서의 생활 18개월 후 이제는 쿠바 다른 지역으로 전쟁을 확장시켜야 할 때가 왔다. 체게바라와 그의 추종자들은 595km를 행군하여 쿠바의 수도 아바나로부터 4시간 거리의 라스피아스에 도착했다.
In late 1958 that he met Aleida March. She was a supporter of the July 26 movement.
알레이다는 체의 캠프로 무기와 지시문을 몰래 반입해 줬는데 한 번은 임무 수행 중 정체가 탄로났다.
She ended up staying in the mountains and joining Che. And in the course of the coming weeks, as they left the Escambray to do battle against Batista's army in the towns around Santa Clara, they became lovers.
한편 게릴라전은 더욱 치열해졌다. 인원이 800명으로 증가한 피델 카스트로 일행은 오리엔테주를 통과해 이동하기 시작했고 체는 정부군과 맞서 싸우면서 적의 심리를 이용한 게릴라 전술로 적군을 겁주는 작전을 펼쳤다.
Monday, at 1 in the morning, one rebel went and took one shot into the garrison. And got, of course, this massive firepower response. Then went home or went to sleep or went to do something else. The next night, a couple of rebels, one at 11 o'clock and one at 4 in the morning, did the same thing, one shot. By the third night, that garrison was always up and not sleeping. They basically made these people just want to leave. And sure, after about 2 weeks, that garrison just abandoned camp and went into town. You're in a situation where you're thinking you're fighting a superior enemy. That morale-wise, that cannot be very good. I think that definitely affected the Batista army.
1958년 12월 27일 피델 카스트로는 체에게 산타클라라 공격을 지시했다. 이곳은 바티스타 정부군의 최종 집결지로서 체의 군사들보다 10배나 많은 340명이 모여 있었다.
The troops were drilled. They knew what they were doing. They knew they had a good commander. They had Che was top of the line. They trusted him. We had been monitoring shortwave, Radio Rebelde, and from Santa Clara, from where Che was, and the news didn't sound good. The rebel transmission was that they're getting clobbered.
하지만 이것은 오보였다.
They're fighting against an army which is larger, but the people that get conscripted into the army are really very, very poor people. They have no stake in Batista staying in power.
Realizing the futility of resistance, they surrendered, and more than 100 guns passed over to the side of freedom.
죄가 이끄는 반란군은 보급품을 싣고 산타클라라로 가는 장갑 열차를 잠복 공격함으로써 정부군에 대한 공격을 마무리했다.
December 31st, 1958, Batista fled Havana with his entourage and several millions of dollars in cash.
바티스타가 떠났다는 소식이 퍼지자 정부군은 항복하기 시작했다.
Fidel ordered Che to march on Havana from Santa Clara, while he himself made a more leisurely victory parade the length of the island.
32살의 피델 카스트로와 그의 반란군은 1959년 1월 8일에 아바나에 도착했다.
Today, all eyes, those of the powerful oppressors and those of the hopeful, are fixed on us.
체의 꿈은 라틴 아메리카를 사회주의로 통합하는 것이며 미국에게 휘둘리지 않는 새로운 세계 질서를 세우는 것이었다. 이를 위해서는 공산주의 혁명을 대륙 전체에 퍼뜨려야 했지만 그 전에 수없이 많은 피를 흘리지 않으면 안 됐다. (1959년 1월 2일) 쿠바의 아바나. 피델 카스트로와 체게바라가 이끄는 반란군은 쿠바 대통령 풀젠시아 바티스타의 정부군에 맞서 2년 동안의 게릴라식 전투를 치르고 난 뒤 마침내 쿠바 정권을 장악했다. 하바나에서 앞으로 체가 맡게 된 임무는 저항 세력을 제거함으로써 새 혁명정부의 권위를 굳게 세우는 것이었다. 바티스타가 패배를 시인하고 달아났기 때문에 피델 카스트로와 반란군은 자랑스럽게 하바나의 진군에 들어왔다.
We were received as liberators, celebrated. I mean, people ran out with bottles of rum. People went wild.
It was a marvelous experience. I think for the first time in my life we were able to see the people of Cuba united, with one vision, one love, and that it was the most beautiful thing you can see in Cuban history.
2년 동안 산속에서 생활했던 반란군은 하바나에서의 각종 유혹을 떨쳐버리기 어려웠다.
Che had to issue stricter orders on the behavior of his young men who, arriving in Havana for the first time, finding all of these beautiful young women, in essence throwing themselves at them. It was, as Leda described it to me, something of an orgy taking place, particularly in the bushes below the great statue of Christ.
체의 아내인 일다는 2년 전 게릴라 운동이 일어난 이후로 체를 만나보지 못했기 때문에 체에게 다른 여자가 생긴 줄도 모른 채 딸을 데리고 하바나에 찾아왔다.
And immediately he told her that he was no longer in love with her and he wanted a divorce. Che was married to Leda just a couple of months later in a small ceremony with Raul Castro acting as one of his witnesses.
체가 개인사를 정리하는 동안 피델 카스트로는 쿠바의 첫 개혁을 추진하기 시작했다.
Well, in the beginning, most of the population was expecting a change. Castro, always he was in the mountains. He promised free election in 18 months.
There is not communism or Marxism in our ideas. We will not seize any land from anybody.
하지만 반란군이 승리한 지 불과 2개월 만인 2월 16일 피델 카스트로가 수상 취임 선서를 냈고 약속했던 선거는 이루어지지 않았다.
Then certain segments of the professional class and the elite and the middle class began to view Fidel Castro and his regime with suspicion.
There was a debate that started almost from the day Castro took power about whether he was a communist or not. And part of this debate focused on Che Guevara, who obviously did get on the radar screen pretty quickly of the CIA.
피델은 공산주의자와의 연합이 알려지면 지도자 자리를 빼앗길 것이 두려워 체와 다소 거리를 두기 시작했다.
He ordered Che to take over the La Cabaña fortress, which is an old colonial garrison overlooking Havana Harbor and the city.
That was where the war criminals were tried.
체는 유죄 판결을 받은 자의 사형 집행을 명령했다.
In essence, carrying on with what he had been doing in the war, summary trials for torturers, for men accused of war crimes, and carrying out their firing squad executions in La Cabaña.
미국인 게릴라였던 닐 맥콜리는 수개월 동안 반란군과 함께 지내며 군사훈련을 도왔다. 그는 조총부대의 지휘관직을 맡아 첫 번째 공개 처형을 집행해달라는 제안을 받았다.
I said, look, this is a matter for Cubans. You guys do it. And he said, no, but look, they make a mess of it. We need somebody who's at least going to hit the mark. I was prevailed upon. I did. I didn't mind. I mean, I'm glad to shoot these guys. And so I walked out there. I took command of the firing squad. I directed them against him. And I mean, this time, killed him. And then the next guy who came up, I took that one too.
이후 18개월 동안 수백 혹은 수천 명이 이 조총부대에 의한 총살령을 당했다. 이는 체게바라의 악명을 더욱 굳건하게 만들었다.
Both of them, they are killers, they are murderers. Castro has killed thousands of people and Che Guevara has killed thousands of people too. So Che was a devil.
혹자는 죄수들과 함께 무고한 사람도 수없이 처형됐다고 주장한다.
That's the reason why a lot of people hate him so much, because he caused so many families to grieve.
Were innocents killed? Possibly. I don't know of any particularly.
What this did, though, is it showed that Fidel meant business. Don't mess with the revolution. Cuba's a dangerous place.
체가 전쟁 심판을 계속하는 동안 미국에선 물론 전 세계에서 새 정권에 관한 같은 의문이 일었고 구소련 수상 니키타 후르시초프 역시 관심을 나타냈다.
My father asked intelligence, KGB, his political analyst, who are these guys? They was answered that one Central American dictator replaced another Central American dictator. For sure, they're pro-United States and maybe they're agent of CIA. There was no idea that they can be socialism.
피델 카스트로는 미국의 우려를 잠재워야 한다는 것을 깨닫고 1959년 4월 15일 워싱턴으로 갔다.
He met with Vice President Nixon, claimed famously to the American press that he was not a Marxist, denied it, and said he was a democratic humanist. Fidel, at least in those initial months, kept everyone guessing.
하지만 피델 카스트로는 이미 남모르게 쿠바의 공산당과 손을 잡은 상태였다.
It'll always be an open question whether Fidel became a Marxist himself because of pragmatic opportunity or evolved over time.
피델 카스트로가 체의 이념적 확신에 영향을 받았다는 것은 의심할 여지가 없다.
Che was vital in being a sounding board and an advisor to Fidel during the key years in the Sierra when he built up his role as the revolutionary strongman and also in turning him leftward.
피델은 쿠바를 변화시키는 데 있어 체와 같은 이념을 공유하고 함께 의논에 결정했다.
Secretly, he had Che and some of his more radical colleagues meeting and privately drafting the outlines of the future communist state of Cuba.
새 정부는 쿠바 농지 개혁법을 제정해 사유재산을 몰수할 계획을 세우기 시작했다. 하지만 계획을 실행하기도 전에 체는 외국으로 보내졌다.
So to American spies watching Cuba and even a lot of Cubans, they thought that Fidel has marginalized Che. He's gotten that radical out of the way.
1959년 6월 12일 체는 아시아, 아프리카, 유럽 여러 나라를 방문하고 처음으로 구소련과 접촉하게 된다. 비록 미국은 거절했지만 체는 구소련에 쿠바산 설탕을 사달란 제안을 했다.
It was the rule of the Cold War, even that you don't think that these people will be your allies or your friends. But if they're trying to do something negative to your enemy, you have to help them.
구소련에서는 미국이 거절한 물품을 사주기로 했다.
They need weapons, so Soviet Union started to sell their old Soviet tanks and some fighters, airplanes.
구소련에서는 석유까지 공급해줬다. 쿠바에 있는 미국 정년소에서는 이를 거부했기 때문이었다.
Che had a public face and a clandestine existence, which was understood and encouraged by Fidel.
피델은 체의 공로를 인정했다. 산업부 장관으로서 쿠바 정부에서 사로의 중요한 역할을 맡게 됐으며 아울러 쿠바 국립은행 총재에 임명된 것이다.
He showed his disdain for the mercantile world and money by merely signing the Cuban bank bills. Che.
To me, it was an insult to the Cuban people when he signed the first currency, and he signed 체게바라. That was an insult.
쿠바의 자본주의 체제는 차츰 붕괴돼 갔다.
Castro, he decreased the standard of living, so instead of making richer everybody, he made poor everybody.
피델 카스트로는 농지 개혁안에 서명했고 1959년 5월 7일엔 마침내 대규모 농경지에 대한 첫 번째 몰수가 이루어졌다.
The people, they start to see the reality, what's coming on. And pretty soon, the Cubans, they start the exodus to Miami.
수천 명이 쿠바를 떠나자 체는 더욱 극단적인 계획을 세웠다.
just a favorite argument of Che's was that in order for Cuba to become truly politically sovereign, it had to become economically independent of the United States. And the only way to do that was to sever all economic links with the United States.
미국은 쿠바에만 수십억 달러를 투자한 상태였다.
Everything was owned by the United States. The electricity company, the ports, the mines, the twice daily airline shuttle to Miami, the television stations.
미국에서 쿠바의 석유 정제를 거부하자 피델 카스트로는 모든 외국 석유 회사를 국유함으로써 이에 대응했고 미국은 이에 보복하기 위해 쿠바와의 외교 관계를 단절했다. 10달도 채 안 돼 쿠바 내 미국 회사는 전부 문을 닫았다. 미국에선 이에 맞서 쿠바로 가는 수출품을 실은 선박의 운행을 전면 중단했다. 미국과 쿠바의 긴장이 거세지자 쿠바 정권의 저항 세력은 모두 반혁명분자나 범죄자로 비춰졌다. 심지어 종교활동마저 탄압을 받아 가톨릭 사제 몇십 명이 쿠바에서 추방되기 이르렀다.
Over a Bible, they promise to fight until we had Cuba free or until death. And mainly the founders of that organization, my organization, they die in front of the firing squad. The killings were terrible, everywhere.
I didn't want to live under a regime like that, and my wife didn't want to.
수천 명이 쿠바를 떠남으로써 미국과 정면대결을 펼칠 무대가 완성됐다. 피델 카스트로의 혁명 정부는 더 이상 용납될 수 없었다.
Frankly, he's uncontrollable. And that was the key. We cannot control him. You see the clear CIA memoranda saying Fidel Castro has to be eliminated and the Cuban Revolution has to be rolled back and we need to go forward with a plan to overthrow the Castro government.
체게바라의 꿈이었던 쿠바의 공산화가 현실로 이루어지면서 미국의 아이젠하워 대통령은 비공개 회의를 열었다. 이제 조치를 취할 시기가 왔으며 보이지 않는 전쟁이 막 시작됐다.